I have purchased and am currently testing every mirrorless camera lens under $100, and this little lens has probably been the biggest surprise package of all of them so far. And I'm really shocked that more people aren't talking about it. With all the budget lenses I cover on this channel, I would have thought I would have had more comments talking about this lens. The images coming out of this lens are so far above the price point. Looking at sharpness and detail, the quality of the background blur, color and contrast, I really cannot believe that we are looking at a sub $100 lens here. The lens also happens to be the same focal length and similar in size and specifications to one of my other favorite budget lenses, and that is the TTArtisan's 25mm f2 lens. And I will circle back later in the video and kind of talk about which lens I might prefer for which purpose. The other thing that happens is every time I cover one of these budget lenses that I bought recently on the channel, they almost always sell out. So I have searched out a few different sources of where you will be able to buy the lens, because once I publish this video, it will almost certainly sell out. But I've got a couple of links in the description down below to where I expect that you should still be able to find the lens in stock. So what is this lens? This is a 25mm f1.8 lens by 7Artisans. And 25mm on a crop sensor or APS-C sensor camera is considered the most versatile focal length that you can use on one of these cameras. 25mm on a crop sensor camera has the field of view that is similar to 37.5 on a full frame camera. And this is a very versatile, semi-wide focal length that allows you to document everyday life, walk around birthday parties, going out to dinner with friends or family, walking around a city, going to an art gallery. You're going to get a wide enough field of view to capture an image of a person or an object in the environment they're in, but get that sort of surrounding and context around them. But if you want to get close to someone and get a more of a portrait style shot and isolate the subject, all you got to do is step in a few feet, get a little bit closer, open up that aperture to f1.8. You're going to be able to blur out that background, and you're going to be able to get a more traditional blurry style portrait shot with a lens like this. That is something that most focal lengths don't do. This is that perfect Goldilocks in the middle focal length that can do all of these things. The other thing it's going to be great for is street photography and travel. Now, when we look at street photography, 35mm on a full frame camera or around 23mm on a crop sensor camera or APS-C sensor camera is considered the most versatile do-it-all focal length for street photography. And there's a lot of people out there that think that that is essentially the only focal length that you should use for street photography. There's this sort of traditional mindset amongst a lot of people. This is going to get you very, very close to that focal length or that field of view. Being the equivalent of 37.5, 25mm on an APS-C sensor camera, just going to give you that little bit of extra isolation, that little bit of extra closeness, which I don't mind for street photography because it allows me to get that little bit further away from my subject. But absolutely, this is a fabulous lens for street photography. You probably just set it to f5.6, f8, just go around, shoot all day with that. You could even do what they call zone focus with this lens, where you set it to a focus distance anywhere from sort of 1 meter to 10 meters or something like that. And you know anything in that range would be in focus, and then you just point and shoot. This is also an excellent video lens. That 25mm, once again, is enough of that field of view that you can demonstrate a subject or somebody in the scene they're in, but it gives you that little bit of extra leeway where somebody's moving around the scene, unlike something like a 35mm lens on a crop sensor camera. This gives you just that little bit more room for them to move and kind of demonstrate the action and show what's happening in the scene. With video, you always want to go that little bit wider because that allows somebody to move in the scene, in the environment, and you're not panning and chasing them around with the camera. This will allow you to just get back that a few little steps and show them, so in an art gallery, birthday party, walking through a city, what have you. And it's just really a good all-purpose versatile focal length for video as well. The other thing you're going to find is going down to f1.8, you are going to get very good low light performance. And particularly when we compare this to something like the kit lens, because I think a lot of people looking at lenses like this, they're starting out with a kit lens, they want to upgrade to something better. But if you're looking at this focal length and this aperture, 25mm, f1.8, in a good quality autofocus lens, the price starts to creep up very, very quickly. So this is going to get you that blurry background ability and that better low light performance than your kit lens for a very small investment. And you are going to see a dramatic difference between shooting with this lens at f1.8 and shooting with your kit lens, which at 25 millimeters is probably going to be somewhere around f4 or f5.6. This is going to let in something like 4 times the light. That means that your image is going to be 4 times cleaner and 4 times more clear than it might be with your kit lens set to 25 millimeters. And even though this is a budget lens, nothing about the feel of it in the hand is like a budget lens. You've got an all metal lens body, you've got a metal lens mount. This is an all manual focus, manual aperture lens, and the manual focus is very, very smooth and well dampened. And the aperture is a D-clicked aperture ring, which is very smooth. And it's just stiff enough that I don't worry about bumping it out of place. When you set it, it does stay there. Now, generally for photography, I prefer a clicked aperture ring, which that TTArtisan's 25mm f2 lens does have and this doesn't. But having a D-clicked aperture ring is generally an advantage for video shooters. So that might be a situation where a video shooter might prefer the 7-Artisan lens over the TTArtisan lens, just for that sort of D-clicked aperture ring. This is an APS-C or crop sensor lens, and it is available on all the popular mirrorless mounts. And I will put some links in the description down below to all the different lens mounts it's available on. Just having a look at Vignette, with a lot of these budget lenses that have wide maximum apertures, they often have very heavy vignette. I think because this one just goes to f1.8 rather than something like f1.4, f1.2, or f0.95. Those lenses often have very heavy vignette. This one at f1.8 does not have heavy vignette, which says to me that they really aren't trying to exceed what the optics are capable of. They've kind of set it at f1.8, which is getting us a very good vignette performance. Now, when we look at chromatic aberration, this is another thing that a lot of these budget lenses really suffer from, but I found very, very little chromatic aberration. Even in the in-focus or out-of-focus areas, there was never a situation where I saw chromatic aberration in the image that I thought was distracting. And I think at the price point this is at, it's probably one of the better performers when it comes to chromatic aberration. The lens does exhibit the most modest amount of barrel distortion, but this is only really noticeable if you've got a rectangular object, which the edges go close to the edge of frame, but in most real-world scenarios, you will not notice it whatsoever. The flare performance on this lens is not great, but it's in line with other lenses at a similar price point. I think this is just because the coatings on these lenses aren't quite up to the standards of lenses that cost $2, $3, let alone thousands of dollars. So the flare performance is not great, but I don't think it's any worse than any other lenses in the category. Some people even like these crazy flares just for their artistic sort of representation or rendering. In most real world situations, it won't be a problem. But if you are shooting at night with street lights, car headlights, things like this, you are going to get some crazy psychedelic flares, which can ruin or improve your image depending on what you're shooting for. I've noticed an interesting flare performance characteristic on this lens, and that's at f1.8 with light going directly into the lens. It can be absolutely terrible, but you stop it down to f4 and it's almost perfect. But when you go back and forth between the two, you get this zooming circle of contrast that is kind of weird. But just something to be aware of, not a deal breaker by any means, but something to be aware of. Probably the amazing bonus feature of this lens, which I really didn't expect and is a place that cheap lenses are almost always bad at, is the close focus ability and the image quality and sharpness and detail at that minimum focus distance. At f1.8, when you get close to something and open it up all the way to f1.8, you're getting a very sharp and detailed image, but you're also getting an extremely blurry background because the closer you get to anything, regardless of what aperture you've got, the more you are going to be able to blur that background. And so you get some really beautiful, nice, soft background blur in those close focus images, but you've got plenty of detail as well. And if you're doing like a product shot, if you have something that you're not so worried about getting a blurry background, and you just want a lot of sharpness and detail, you stop this thing down to f4 or f8, f5.6, you are going to get an extremely sharp image, which is in line with some of the best Sony, Canon, Nikon lenses out there. Stop down, this lens is extremely sharp at that minimum focus distance. And if I was gonna pick my favorite thing about this lens, it would be the quality of the bokeh and the background blur. It is so smooth and creamy and dreamy and just forms such a nice backdrop for whatever is in focus in your frame. The only times that I thought it got a little bit nervous or jittery or distracting was when you had a situation where you had a complex background, often foliage or some detailed patterns. Sometimes you would get a little bit of nervousness, but in most situations that I used it in, all I got was a creamy, dreamy, beautiful background blur. And certainly if I would say what is my favorite thing about this lens, it would be the quality of the background blur for the price you're paying for this lens. And looking at the sharpness and detail performance on the lens, I think it's about as good or there in line with any of the sub $100 lenses I've tested. It's probably as good as lenses that cost, $500 or $600 at times. Once you stop it down, it's as sharp as anything out there. At f1.8, it is a good performer without being perfect or razor sharp, but I think for the price point, the sharpness and detail rendered by this lens is absolutely excellent. Looking at the TTArtisan's 25mm f1.8 lens, I really can't talk about this lens in isolation because I've also got the TTArtisan's 25mm f2 lens. And these are very, very similar lenses. Now, if you look at the TTArtisan's lens, you're going to get that lens for a little bit cheaper. I think it'll be about $10 or $15 cheaper, depending on where you're getting it at. The TTArtisan's lens is a tiny bit smaller, but nothing that I think would make a deal-breaking difference. The TTArtisan's lens does have a clicked aperture ring, which I prefer for photography, particularly street photography. And overall, I do like the aesthetic and design of the TTArtisan's lens better, just looking at it from the way it looks point of view. The biggest disadvantage I see in the TTArtisan's lens is that it exhibits what's called field curvature, which is where the focal plane, when you're focusing on something in the middle of the image, by the time you get to the corners, that focus plane is shifted where the thing in the middle of the image might be in focus. And even if the thing in the corner is in the same plane of focus, it's no longer focused out there. It is an odd effect which can create situations where you've got something in the middle of the frame that's in focus, and then you've got something in the corner of frame that is in the background that is out of focus. This is primarily a problem when you are shooting wide open at f2.0, and I'll throw some examples on screen now so you can kind of see what that looks like. You'll see we've got this weird thing where the corners are all of a sudden in focus. Now, this lens is TTArtisan's lens. I primarily use it as a street photography lens. I love the look. I love the feel. I love the clicked aperture ring that locks in. I don't have to worry about bumping it around. So when I'm out shooting at f5.6 or f8 for street photography, that field curvature is not an issue, and the TTArtisan's lens is the lens I choose. Looking at the TTArtisan's lens, it goes to f1.8. So you're going to get a little bit better low light. You're going to get a little bit better background blur. Also, if you're shooting video, the aperture ring is declicked. So you can change that aperture in video and you're not going to have any problems. You're not going to get any jerky movements or clicking in your audio. The other thing about the TTArtisan's lens that I like is it doesn't have that field curvature issue, which means that the focal plane remains relatively consistent from the center of frame to the corner of frame. The other thing that I do like about the TTArtisan's lens is I think it has a better quality of background blur, particularly when you've got it wide open. At f1.8 compared to the TTArtisan's at f2, the quality of the background blur and the TTArtisan's is noticeably smoother. Looking at sharpness and detail, both of these lenses are virtually indistinguishable from each other. They both resolve about the same amount of sharpness and detail. You will notice that the TTArtisan's lens does have a little bit higher contrast. Just ignore the color shift in these shots because I did not set the white balance manually in the camera. The TTArtisan's lens is about 10 or 15 bucks more expensive, but in the end, I think I would kind of choose these lenses depending on what your use case is. If you're going to use the lens top down, if you're going to use the lens as a everyday street photography sort of walk around lens, I really like the TTArtisan's lens and you're going to save yourself a little bit of money. If you're going to be shooting wide open most of the time, the TTArtisan's lens is going to get you a more blurry background. It's going to get you a little bit lower, better low light, and it's going to get you a better quality of background blur. So in those cases, I think I would choose the TTArtisan's lens. Now, buying a new lens is only one way to improve the qualities of your photos or videos. And I've just thrown a video on screen now. I think this is the best tutorial I've ever done on photography. And I'd be very surprised if you watched that video to the end and you weren't a better photographer at the end of that video than you are right now.